past few weeks with massive fight announcements and bookings for future pay-per-views, as well as fight nights going down in dates later in the summer. And I want to get into all of the matchups that I have gotten written down and get some potential feedback from you guys as to which one of those is most intriguing to you. But before we do that, I want to recap what went down in the combat sports world this past weekend, because despite there being no UFC card, it was still a very action-packed weekend. Starting out with Cage Warriors 172, where there was a ton of finishes, and the one fight I believe that went the distance was absolutely insane. The first round, I'm not sure, I can't remember the name of the two guys in it. I think it was the co-main event or the fight before that, but it was an absolutely insane first round, and the pace did not stop from the first round till the end of the fight. But Harry Hardwick went in there against a short notice replacement and captured that Cage Warriors featherweight strap in style. From the second that he walked to that cage to the second that he got the finish, his focus was otherworldly, and I think the future is very bright for him and his brother, and they will be in the UFC eventually. I also believe they're the first brother duo to hold championships in the same organization, at least in Cage Warriors. I don't believe it's ever happened in the UFC. I don't know if there's any other organizations it's happened in, but nonetheless, the future is very bright for the Hardwick brothers. Moving on to the next subject, Jack Catterall versus Josh Taylor 2. No unjust officiating could ruin this decision, and Jack Catterall boxed his way to a decision victory and set up a potential trilogy. I mean, this fight was more entertaining and honestly more competitive down the stretch than the first fight, especially because there wasn't as much hugging and holding and stop and start in the action as in the first one. And the referee also didn't play a factor in the start and stop as was the case in the first fight. And it showed the differences in the result, which was Catterall getting that decision. And I think this sets up a trilogy for them too, which we will see announced eventually. They are basically tailor-made for each other. It's two slick southpaws, one who has relentless pressure and is very hard-headed and seeking that knockout shot, and the other one is a slick cat who can pop shot and hit and not get hit. And I think a trilogy for them is imminent. Also, another fight in the boxing world that was announced was the rematch for Tyson Fury versus Alexander Usyk, which is expected to go down at the end of this year. I think it was December. I could be wrong, but it is going to be at the end of 2024. Now, I'm going to go through a list of fights that have been booked for future UFC cards, and just going to kind of briefly talk about some of them, just depending on what comes to my mind when I list them out. But some are a little less known than others, regardless. Before we get into the matchups, though, I do want to talk about Conor McGregor, because there was a live stream, I believe, last week that he appeared on where he was absolutely sounding off on a bunch of different fighters and just talking loads of garbage to them, like spewing hatred, spewing venom at them like old Conor does. And it was cool. But then there was another video that surfaced of him in a club partying, and mind you, UFC 303 is about 5 weeks away, so slightly concerning, because you got Michael Chandler, who's basically been on the shelf for 4 years in anticipation for this opportunity, who's probably training like a dog. But nonetheless, I know that Conor's going to come correct for however long that fight lasts. I just wanted to make light of that situation. Now let's get into these fight announcements. So, we've got Ramon Taveras versus Keelan Loughran for, I believe that will be UFC Vegas 94.
Nope.
Ramon Taveras had a great fight against Series City, and that was a rematch from the Contender Series this past season. And Keelan Loughran's last fight against Angel Pacheco was incredibly entertaining. So I think that this is a fight that could fly under the radar for a lot of people. Oh, so Loughran and Taveras will be going down on UFC 304. That's one of those sleeper fights, though. Next is Corey Sandhagen versus Umar Nurmagomedov. That's going to go down on the UFC Abu Dhabi card, which is shaping out to be absolutely insane. Since we're on the subject of the UFC Abu Dhabi card, it was announced today that Nick Diaz versus Vicente Luque and Tony Ferguson versus Michael Chiesa will also be on that card in Abu Dhabi, which is insane. Like, what year is it? You know what I mean? But intriguing. I can't say that's not the case, you know? Intriguing. Next, Peyton Talbot versus Yanni Gamori. And this is going down at UFC 303, which is that Conor Chandler card. Peyton Talbot is a problem. Plain and simple. Like, he's very diverse. He's very athletic. He's very explosive. And he's very comfortable in that cage. That's a dangerous recipe for a fighter. All I'm going to say. Manel Kape versus Mohamed Mokaev. Another matchup for UFC 304. Mind you, UFC 304 is headlined by the highly anticipated rematch between Bilal Muhammad and Leon Edwards, which is now going to be for the UFC welterweight strap. Their first fight wasn't, but their first fight ended in a no contest. So UFC 304 is shaping out to be a great card as well. Next matchup. This is an interesting scenario because originally we were supposed to get Alex Perez versus Tagir Ulanbekov and Joshua Van versus Tatsuro Taira on the UFC Vegas 93 card, which is on June 15th. And they basically did like a full flip-flop where now it's going to be Alex Perez versus Tatsuro Taira in the main event, which I'm very intrigued by considering how good and active Alex Perez has looked and been so far in the past year. And we're going to get Joshua Van versus Tagir Ulanbekov, which is another good matchup because Joshua Van in his short time in the UFC has shown that he belongs, and Tagir Ulanbekov is battle-tested through and through. So that June 15th card is shaping out to have a nice little narrative to it. Let's hope that it's kept together. Next, we got Dan Ige versus Joe Anderson Brito. I mean, if you've seen Joe Anderson Brito call out Dan Ige,
Hey, Dan
Hey,
Ige! Dan Ige, oh, the Dan Ige is the call. What's the problem with Dan Ige?
it's hilarious. And Dan Ige has had some very impressive performances and has been basically like the working man's favorite fighter in the UFC because he just goes in there, does his bread and butter, and does what he's good at. And sometimes he comes out with the win, sometimes he comes out with an impressive knockout, and sometimes he comes up short. But best believe Dan Ige is going in there to scrap, and he ain't giving up on himself. And that's why I'm a fan. Brito versus Ige is insanely intriguing. All right, a couple more matchups that I want to name off, and then I'll get out of your hair. But I'm telling you, UFC has been absolutely cooking we've got another matchup on UFC 303, Ian Gary versus Michael Venom Page. I feel like if there's one person that can beat Ian Gary at this very moment, it's Michael Venom Page, and that's simply because of how just difficult of a fighter Michael Venom Page is. He's so slick. You can't really tell what he's going to do. He hides a lot of his best techniques very, very well. And as far as being a complete mixed martial artist, he definitely passes that test. So I think there's a chance that Ian Gary's O is gone courtesy of MVP. Here's another narrative for you. We were going to get Jamal Hill versus Khalil Roundtree Jr. at UFC 303, and Roundtree tested positive for a banned substance, which he stated he unknowingly took. Nonetheless, he's out of UFC 303, and in stepped Carlos Ulberg, who is on a very good streak, honest say, and is surging into the top 10. Respect to Jamal Hill for taking a fight like this, considering he's coming off that tough loss against Alex Pereira. It's going to be on Jamal Hill to reestablish his position in the light heavyweight rankings, considering he's a former champion, with a win against a surging contender like Carlos Ulberg. I'm intrigued by this matchup, but I'm curious to see if the quick turnaround following the TKO to Pereira is going to be a problem for Jamal Hill. Hoping not, but we will see. Another really intriguing fight. Steve Garcia versus Sungwoo Choi for UFC Vegas 94. And another very recently announced fight for UFC Abu Dhabi is Davison Figueiredo versus Marlon Vera, which I believe will be at 135. And this was a fight that's been brewing for quite some time, very similarly to Figgy versus Petr Yan, which, depending on how Figgy versus Cheeto goes, will be possibly next. So, a lot of intriguing storylines as far as the UFC and the fights that they have lined up. And one final announcement that I believe was booked either yesterday, almost positive it was yesterday. Christian C-Rod Rodriguez versus Julian Rosa on the UFC Denver card, July 13th. I just named off so many damn fights, man. So, with that being said, go back and listen to all of the fights that I named off. Let me know which one is most intriguing to you and which one you're looking forward to most. Keep in mind, UFC 304 also has Tom Aspinall versus Curtis Blades for the UFC Interim Heavyweight Championship. Arnold Allen versus Giga Chikadze. Paddy Pimblett versus Bobby Green. And, like I mentioned, Keelan Loughran versus Ramon Taveras to open up the early prelims.
Nope.
Or to open up the main prelims. Lots of good fights, man. Let me know which one you're looking forward to most. Hopefully you enjoyed the rant. Appreciate you watching. As always, stay grinding. I'll see you in the next one.